This is the beginning of podcast number 14 on Chapter 12, Assessing Student Learning. Traditional assessment in physical education is usually consisting of exams, written exams, skills tests, fitness testing, those kinds of things. But they all address or assess student performance, but so does authentic assessment or alternative assessment that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's important to remember that assessment provides a direct measure of your own teaching through the student's assessments. Assessment is the gathering and collection of information framed by how that information is used. Assessment can be classified as assessment for learning or assessment for accountability. Assessment for learning is what we call formative assessment, and assessment for accountability is what we call summative assessment. Usually summative assessment is in the form of grades, and formative assessment is in the form of feedback. An example of assessment for accountability is typically the large-scale standardized testing, like yearly statewide tests, but we usually don't have those in physical education. Closest thing we have is fitnessgram testing. Assessment for learning shares the following characteristics. It's linked directly to instruction. It views the student as the primary client. It's meaningful. It happens as part of instruction, and it's embedded in instruction, and students know what they're supposed to learn ahead of time, and is developmentally appropriate. Alternative assessment is meaningful assessment in real live or real world settings. The primary purpose of assessment in physical education altogether is to provide meaningful feedback to students in an ongoing process, not just one time during the year. The last bullet here says teacher observation, exit slips, student journals, homework, peer observation, self-assessment, event tasks, videotape and digital analysis, student drawings and displays, and student portfolios are all viable assessment types for learning items in physical education classes. There is a variety of assessments you can use even in pre-K classes. We also use rubrics quite a lot in physical education. Holistic rubrics are when you take the skill and look at the whole performance, or the gameplay rubrics, and analytic rubrics, which analyze skills for students. They're used to distribute assessment criteria to students ahead of time and subsequently evaluate student performance later on. You should always give the criteria for performance, whether it's in the cognitive, affective, or motor domains, to the students ahead of time. Teach them about those things and then show them how they're going to be assessed on those things. The second bullet there says that you should assess in all three learning domains, just like we have objectives and lessons for all three domains. When student achievement is reported to parents, usually through reports that go home or other means, they should be made aware of what students have learned in physical education and where they are with respect to essential learning, not where they are in comparison to other students in the class. Comparing students to other students in the class would be what we call norm-referenced evaluation or assessment, and comparing them to a criteria is what we call criterion reference. That's what we're talking about here in physical education. Grades should be based on the objectives of the course or the learning goals of the course. Assessment should be teacher-friendly and student-friendly, and it should ask and answer two questions: what was learned, and the second question, how well was it learned? Assessment determines the extent a student can demonstrate in context his or her understanding. When we say in context, we mean the real-life settings that they're going to be performing in, such as on the tennis court, on a volleyball court, on a track, in the swimming pool, and so on. But those real-life settings occur in all three domains. What was learned and how well was it learned? The terms alternative, authentic, and performance assessments are all saying the same thing. They are alternatives to traditional, very objective type assessments. What is validity? Validity is the extent to which an assessment measures what it says it will measure. and that's what we call and validity is very important in assessment to make sure that you are actually assessing them on what you say you're assessing them on. One of the best ways to have valid assessments is to make sure that the teachers create the assessments instead of a standardized company outside of your classroom trying to make assessments for your teaching. It's better for teachers to create their valid tests. Reliability means the extent to which the test is consistent no matter who's taking the test or the assessment. There are 3 steps in the process of designing assessments. First step is, how does the assessment relate to your program goals or your unit goals or your lesson goals? What you want your students to learn in a given period of time. What is it that you want them to learn? Number 2, are the assessments linked to one another so they gradually build into more complex and challenging assessments? Do you start out with more informal assessments that are also related um, to more formal assessments later on? And number 3, to what milestone or benchmark does the assessment connect and how? In other words, are they linked to South Carolina standards? What objectives are you using in your lessons, and which South Carolina standards are they linked to? That's an important thing to remember because those linkages determine what type of assessments you use. Some characteristics of assessment are any assessment should be linked to the instructional tasks or the practice tasks that you ask your students to do. They should also match the learning goals. In other words, they should go from simple to complex, from mastery of basic skills to combination of skills, and to using skills in dynamic or ever-changing situations, such as open skills. They should also provide feedback to the teacher and to the student on the student's progress, as well as the teacher's progress in teaching the subject or the skill. Teachers should be encouraged to develop their own assessments which are specific to their context, and as I said a few slides ago, that increases the validity of the assessment. The assessment should always match the learning goals, and the key is to look at the behavioral verbs of all of the objectives. Those behavioral verbs should tell you exactly what type of assessment you should be using to determine whether you've actually achieved that objective or not. Some appropriate practices for assessment are that teachers' decisions should be based on ongoing assessments of performance. It should not be taken from one assessment of fitness testing during the year. It should be ongoing. Fitness testing should be ongoing all throughout the year. Any other types of assessments should be embedded into the unit that you're teaching. You don't just want one snapshot at one time. You need to use a variety of assessment techniques across all areas of learning, the cognitive, affective, and the physical performances. It's important to note here that fitness testing is all right to do in your classes to help students see where they are in their fitness components, but they should be encouraged to try to improve on their own scores to help improve their performance. They should not be used for grading. That is not an appropriate use of fitness testing, to use that for grades, because a lot of fitness testing has nothing to do with someone's ability to do something. A lot of it has to do with hereditary concerns. Some inappropriate practices for assessment are that the assessments address primarily compliance with rules and procedures in physical education. Dress, attendance, and effort sometimes are taken as the major part of the grade for some physical education teachers. Those things have very little to do with the objectives for the lessons for that particular day. Sometimes with physical education teachers, assessment is not multifaceted. They don't assess in all 3 learning domains. They either assess just in the physical domain or just in the cognitive domain, and very rarely in the affective domain. And usually they focus on isolated skills in an artificial context. In other words, not in a game-like context. They have someone hit tennis balls against a wall for as many times as they can in 30 seconds in a skills test. Well, how many times do you hit a ball against the wall in tennis in an actual tennis match? Not very often. It's also important to note here that assessment is the collection of data. Evaluation is the analysis of data to use for a more summative purpose like grading. As we get to alternative assessments, or authentic assessments they are sometimes called, there are 5 characteristics of these alternative assessments. The assessment and the instruction are linked. The assessment is learner-centered. The student is the primary client of the assessment. Assessment is an ongoing part of teaching, not an end or an afterthought. It's part of instruction. It's embedded in instruction. Assessment comprises meaningful tasks that are performed in context. Again, not hitting a tennis ball against a wall, but actually hitting a tennis ball out on a court. And the criteria of the assessment are known in advance. A best example of this is to take a performance rubric or a sport skills rubric and show them what the critical elements are and what they'll be assessed on. This is the end of podcast number 14 on Chapter 12.